Welcome to another presentation of the Relationship Toolbox, a show about learning the skills for building positive relationships with others. Each time we've done this show, you have seen the three of us here, who we are all three professional mediators, and we are very committed to this process of mediation that we're going to be talking about today. We have a passion, I guess, for an experience with watching what happens when people in dispute are actually offered the skills of working together more collaboratively and to see what happens. So with that purpose in mind, we're going to share with you the topic of mediation, what it is, how it works, what the benefits are of it, and we hope you enjoy and find this helpful. So let's start off, first of all, I guess Traci, with let's share with our viewers, what is mediation? Okay. What does it look like?
Yeah. So mediation is, in a nutshell, it's a structured process for resolving conflict, and it involves a neutral third party to come in and help people talk about their conflict respectfully as best they can, and to create ideas for solving their differences. And mediators provide a safe, friendly environment for people to come and talk and for them to discuss their difficult issues that are tough for them to have that conversation on their own for whatever their reasons are, and hopefully create some agreements for change. Mediators don't take sides with anybody, and they don't really have the authority to make any decisions for people, and that's one of the keys about it, is they're there as a neutral, impartial person. And it usually takes place either in a mediator's office or sometimes in a conference room that's also neutral. And it kind of, if you're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what the actual mediation looks like when it's taking place, first one person might contact a mediator, but contacting a mediator initially, and they will set up an intake with that person. They'll set up an intake with other people who are going to be involved in the mediation. And then as long as everyone is wanting to still go forward from there, they'll set up a time and a date to meet. And then when they come in to the mediation itself, we usually have some kind of process for talking about an agreement to mediate, where it talks about what's going to happen in the mediation. You'll come up with an agenda so that everyone's on board with what's going to be discussed that day. And then you kind of start talking about things in terms of communication, what you're having. You get into more specifics about what the difficult part is for you, and people kind of take turns in that portion. And they'll talk about what's difficult for them, and the mediator will guide that conversation so they can communicate well. And then you start to maybe brainstorm a little bit and come up with some solutions that might work moving forward. And then if people reach agreements, coming up with what that's going to look like. Where does that need to go? Does it need to be sent through the court? Is it not court affiliated in any way? What happens with those agreements, and are they just enforced among people, or do they need to be court enforceable, things like that? And all of those things get discussed so that when you leave the room, you have a nice, clear, clean picture of what's going to happen next and what next steps are.
Either leaving with an agreement that day or with an assignment or reflections for the next session.
Yeah.
And I think we find that it's kind of a mixture of content, like what is the problem that people think they've identified, and the process of how to interact with each other. And we have to deal with a little bit of both and guide the difficult conversation and get to the meat of the issue, but in a way that is productive and maybe not the way they've been talking with each other before.
I think that's a key point, that many people may come in thinking, oh, this is useless. I know what's going to happen. We've been talking about this and never gotten anywhere with it. And that's sad, because when we look at situations, as you say, when we've actually worked with them, we can find different ways of approaching it and help people actually with their style of negotiating with each other, so that it is more productive and that it doesn't hit continually those emotional buttons that send people into that conflict cycle that we've talked about in other shows.
And it's protected, and there's as much listening. I think sometimes what is lacking outside of the office when people are in conflict is the receptive part, the listening part, which we also protect as much as the communication part. So
a mediator is actually doing a lot of listening and modeling that for the other people to see, and to assist each party to listen to the other. with it. So that's a key factor in mediation.
And we ask a lot of questions, so we prompt that discussion, and we encourage that listening by asking questions of people also. So, yeah.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about what type of situations might be used in mediation. So if our viewers are out there thinking, well, that's interesting, but how does it apply to me? Let's take a look at some of these.
Well, they're pretty broad, actually. And in your intake, your mediator or mediators will tell you if it's suitable for mediation or not. But partners, husband and wife, could be having chronic problems. They're not at the point where they want to separate and they're throwing the relationship up, but they just have hurdles. And they might need to come to a mediator. Might be about how to spend money, or how to discipline the kids, or where to take a vacation, or there are things that are in a marriage or in a partnership that might need surfacing.
Maybe family visiting or things like that, how they're going to handle people coming and going.
Even clarification of the relationship. Do they want to stay in the marriage?
Yeah, sometimes they don't know.
Right. A mediator can be helpful with that, sometimes in conjunction with a therapist working on those issues.
It could be about the roles that they play as well. If somebody's not happy with the role that they're playing, they want to change or expand the role, that may need to be talked about.
Or if they wanted to actually try out a separation, the mediator could be very effective in saying, okay, if you were to separate, what would be the conditions of your separation? How would you deal with the children? How long would you be separated? And what would tell you when you're ready to come back to the table, basically, and say, I've decided this based upon what I've been working on.
Right. And you're looking for very tangible agreements usually. You're looking for tangible things that they can actually do. So it's not just the discussion about it, but you're coming up with actual things to do.
Right. So a therapist might be working on almost individually with the client about growth and exploring where they are, whereas the mediator is going to be looking at what is the effect of this on this relationship with both people.
And how do we reframe it from where you are? How do we define it?
And how do we negotiate it? Are both of you wanting this type of a marriage or this type of a relationship?
So you could also use it with teenagers and parents
Big
and
ones,
children.
Sure. Things like curfews, or maybe with choice of friends or school, just different things that come up in your typical teenage years.
Substances.
Sure.
What is helpful, I found too, in working with teenagers and parents has been that typically not only parents, but teenagers do not always know the skills for negotiating something, and so they can very easily get into power struggles with each other.
Yeah, we've talked about that on other shows.
Yes.
How to deal with an employer or a parent or a coach or a teacher.
And of course, once you engage that power struggle, things are going to go awry pretty quickly.
Right. And
so
if they don't feel heard.
Yes, and that's a key thing,
which is a key thing, right.
So oftentimes a teenager in a mediation will realize that the parents are hearing them now, they are getting the message. And then also the teenager has to know, how do I respond to these things in a respectful way with it? And then that leads naturally to negotiating.
Right.
So what it is, am I as a parent willing to negotiate with this teenager? How far will I go with this? How much freedom will I grant? And the teenager respecting the needs of the parent as well.
Certainly there is the typical thing that people think of with divorcing parents and all of the trappings that come with that. Contact time and communication, new partners, how to discipline children. And with that comes blended families with a new family. How do you negotiate that? And that could certainly be something that could be brought to mediation. But we're seeing also things like with extended families and inheritance, and how to handle houses and property, and when one child doesn't want to share or lives away and doesn't want to use the house or the property, how are things divided up, and how to maintain a familial relationship when that kind of stress, on top of the grief of losing a parent, then you have all the stress of the property division, which is tricky.
And maybe even prior to that, just the caring for the parents. How is that going to be handled? Who's making the decisions? Where's the financial piece in that? You know, who's paying for certain things?
And there can be some resentment sometimes, particularly if people have been out of state because they haven't been there to take care of the parent, maybe before passing. And that can spill over sometimes into the inheritance. And even before that, how to make decisions thoughtfully with aging parents and end-of-life decisions and care. If a parent can't be taken into a home, then how are those decisions made emotionally and financially? And that's tricky. We've seen mediators come into schools as well. Tom, can you give me some examples of when that would?
I've seen it in trying to work out conditions of an IEP, for example, an educational plan. Sometimes in disputes over how a school is handling a particular consequence for a child with it. So again, these are areas where mediation can be helpful.
It could be as simple as a landlord and a tenant, and or a neighbor, which are kind of mundane things you don't think of. You think you have to either handle it yourself or you take them to court, and there's that intermediate zone of like talking it out with a mediator.
Before you go to small claims court, before that's your final answer, you could always come into play.
You're still going to be neighbors.
Right, right. You are still going to be neighbors. And sometimes that neighboring property, there's just a misunderstanding about something. Sometimes it's not always as concrete. Yes, there's the law and there's the lines that are drawn in the sand, so to speak. But maybe the tree is hanging over a little too far, or something along those lines.
Maybe the dog's barking at night.
Right, something along those lines.
Or a new situation has surfaced that no one anticipated. And there's nothing in a contract or in an agreement for that. So how do we then go proceed with that?
How do we share the plowing? But we've also worked with employers and employees and business partners who are going through a speed bump as their business evolves, and maybe one wants to take a greater role or a lesser role, and how do you negotiate that?
And could I add to the point too, just to make sure our viewers are aware of this, in no way do mediators advise on these issues. We're not there to say this is how you should do it. And that's different.
Right, we're helping people have what they perceive to be a difficult conversation that they
Guiding
may
the
or may not
discussion.
navigate well on their own.
Right, guiding that discussion in a productive way that they can't seem to do on their own. If I always look at things and they say, typical things you hear are, well, there's nothing I can do about it. Right? Or we've already had this conversation, it's not going to go anywhere.
We've had this millions of times.
Exactly. So those are typical things that sometimes get said that I hear over and over again that I think we all address in a different manner. And people, I think, are a little bit surprised sometimes that even though it was a conversation they've had before, it's had in a different way so that it becomes more productive.
I've also experienced people, for instance, like a carpenter, a plumber, a contractor, a builder, who's never had that conversation because there's a fear factor of having it with the customer or the client because there's been a misunderstanding or a change and everybody's just afraid to have it. And so they avoid the conflict until it's huge. And that is also a good thing for mediation. Rather than going to court, I mean, you might have to. We're not saying we are the panacea, but it is something that you can consider.
It's a step.
So I guess that covers, anything else you can think of?
Yeah, I mean,
pretty much.
sometimes among office staff also, just to throw in that workplace piece, is sometimes people who work together don't get along all that well. And usually that builds from misunderstandings and assumptions that we've talked about before. So that often builds from that, and those are things that we can help with as well.
And another way too, mediators can help in a preventative way.
Absolutely.
We do some in terms of office conflict, where we can educate people about negotiating skills and what are the types of conflicts that we can have and how to deal with that before they become to the point you were describing.
Sometimes if it's a big enough company, there'll be an HR, human resources. But for the lack of that, you could check with a private mediator.
So let's talk about what are the advantages of using mediation to solve things, and maybe we'll make some contrasts with this as well. So why don't we start there? What are the advantages?
Yeah.
I think that maybe people don't realize that they are both permitted to and capable of solving something on their own with maybe just the help of a third person to guide them. Because they may not know it exists or what it's about, but mediation can possibly, without the need for the court system or an attorney or an outside authority figure intervening. There are cases when, as consulting, an accountant, an attorney, a therapist might be brought in as a collaboration, but perhaps people don't know. We've just listed some instances where mediation would be applicable. But you can. You have the power, and often you have the answers, if you can just surface them, to on your own find the solution that is specific to your situation.
I would say one of the obstacles to that has been when people come in a high emotional state. And again, mediators are trained to deal with this type of thing. So we understand that, and we have compassion for people in that state, but we try to help them to begin to control that a little bit more. And once that happens, there's almost a magical moment, if it does happen, where you can see, bingo, the light goes on. And as you say, people come up with solutions for their problems that no one would have thought of necessarily. But the freedom to think like that has been released because that emotional energy has been released, that they can begin to think more creatively. And they know their children best.
That's a literal brain function that does not function the same when you're in that, we've talked about this, when you're in that fight or flight mode versus when you're in that calm mode where your emotions are not as high.
I think that's a unique role of a mediator in being able
Nobody's
to tap
saying,
into that.
Oh, I know what you should do. This is what we should do. Here's the first step, the second step.
Right.
No, there's a time for that, but not every situation. And they could come up with their own creative solution together.
Right, because it's their issue to come up with a solution for, right? So they know
some
best.
of these skills that we look at that we've been talking about on the show before, we know about because we use them in mediation. Respecting point of view. This is hard sometimes when you've been arguing about this for some time, or you think you know where that's coming from in the other person. And with the help of the mediator, we can say, no, this is just their point of view. And it doesn't mean that their point of view is any more valid than another one's. But at this point, let's listen to their point of view. And with that qualification, oftentimes parties can begin to actually listen because they know, okay, I'm not losing the argument. I'm just listening to a point of view.
And to understand their point of view without that judgment, if they can, to take that step back and to kind of reflect on what that person is saying without agreeing or disagreeing with it, but just reflecting back what they're hearing. And then checking in with the other person if they're accurate.
And that's part of that skill, is being able to postpone the judgment and the decision so that we can begin to think, okay, let me hear more about that point of view. And as you've pointed out too in the past, being curious to learn more about another person's point of view. So in mediation, that's a great deal of what is going on in a very gentle, supportive way.
Right, which we said at the beginning, that's why the first portion of it is about the communication, and then you move into the negotiation phase. You can't start negotiating right away. It just doesn't, that's not what this is about. So,
and many people, once they've even clarified that and their emotions are settled with it, still don't know necessarily, how do I negotiate?
We guide that process.
Yeah, it's not something that we're necessarily taught in school and everything. So again, that's another process in the mediation that takes place.
It's lacking in either the heated conversation that they have by themselves or even in the courtroom sometimes, because they are not able to be understood. They've just leapt right to the decision making or the negotiation on behalf of them. They are not even getting to voice it.
Each goes with a different premise. I mean, a court goes with the premise of logic. You have to prove the logic, the facts of things, and whoever does that most successfully will probably win with it. And mediation is not like that. We're not looking for winners and losers with it. It's more understanding and creativity.
And to be collaborative in the results. So in addition to that, the process of mediation is confidential, unless otherwise specified. But for the most part, it's confidential, so that we don't go into the courts, we don't speak to anybody about the process, and that's an important piece, because I think it's important for people to know that they can speak freely, and know they can say things that we're not going to take anywhere else.
And be creative, and maybe try stuff on that they wouldn't later in a different situation.
And then it's okay to say no. It's okay to say that and get that out there. And because it's confidential, you don't have to agree to it right away. You're just, like you said, trying it on for size, just to see how it feels.
But should it not work, then they're not bound to that, because
Right.
it was just a trial.
Exactly.
And the confidentiality extends also to the intake interview, that when someone comes in individually and discusses things from his or her point of view, that's not shared with the other party.
person,
With it, you have to share what you want to share.
Right. So you don't bring any of that to the other. We as mediators don't bring that to the other person involved or other people involved. Right. And also the mediators help the parties kind of express their point of view and share their feelings. And we do that. We're professionals that know how to ask questions and draw that out of people to some degree. I think in part based on the confidentiality piece also, people feel more open to speaking freely, and they know that they can just share that with us initially, get it all out on the table, and then they can move forward from there. So that's just an important piece that we encourage them to share their perspective and their point of view. So, yeah. And then,
So why don't we take a look at how mediation is different from other forms of conflict resolution. And we've mentioned in the court, of course, the court is designed to do something very different in that, and it is more adversarial, and you get representation basically to someone to represent you and put your point of view out there and try to win the case. Mediation is in contrast to that, of course. And mediation tends to be very concrete in the here and now, so that, and limited basically to the issues that we're not going to say, oh, that's very interesting. How did you learn to behave in that way? What was your mother like or your father like? We don't go there. In the mediation. We're more concerned with what is the effect of how you are approaching the other person on that other person. And is there a way that the two of you might work more productively together to get what you want as a goal?
And often what happens when you do that is you're focusing on not destroying a relationship, right? You're trying to keep it intact to some degree, if possible, and maybe even building new levels of trust among people that didn't have it before.
Or if it's not going to be a close relationship, at least respectful.
Yeah.
And I think what we're touching on is that it's not a linear continuum, but there's therapy, and then there's the court system, and mediation is kind of somewhere in between, in that we are talking about feelings, we are talking about relationships, which would not happen in court, which would happen in therapy. We are talking about concrete situations and trying to get to a results-oriented situation, which you would get in the court. You might be focusing more on the past, whereas in therapy, whereas we're in mediation, we're saying, given that you're in the situation that you're in, and maybe we'll look about how it got there and what people's residual feelings are, what are you going to do about it? And both of those other polarities, typically in therapy, it's an individual focus. It is in the court system as well. An attorney will represent you as an individual. There may be multiple ones, but we're looking at the system of the people, of the parties.
Relationship.
The relationship, between the two, So, and that's, I think, a distinct uniqueness to mediation, with it, that the respect for the relationship, whether it's with a husband, wife, with a landlord, tenant, neighbors, whether that relationship is respected with it, and hopefully our methods in approaching it will show that and model that.
Parties may still choose to not maintain that relationship. They may decide that the results they want to get are worth giving up the relationship, but not always. There at least is the opportunity to maintain that relationship and come out a win-win, as opposed to having a winner and a loser.
That's a good point too, that one of the uniqueness about mediation too is that if you decide in the process that this isn't what you wanted, this isn't working for you, you can end it.
Right,
that point.
it's a
You know,
choice,
yeah, there's
right.
no financial commitment beyond that. You aren't committed to it, you know. So you have the option and you retain the control of the
Right,
situation.
Right. It's your scenario.
Yes.
Right. Right.
It's usually pretty short term as well.
Yes.
Whereas it may not be as short as, you know, a couple of hours in court, but not nearly as long as maybe a longitudinal study in therapy.
Well, certainly, I'm sorry.
No, but it's manageable and short and focused around something.
And it's about working together, right? I mean, we're focused on helping people figure out how to work together as best they can in whatever given situation they're in. And like you said, sometimes that means maybe the end result is that it's appropriate to dissolve a relationship. And what would that look like? And if that's appropriate for people, then by all means, maybe that's where they agree to go. But again, it's up to them to agree to go there. It's not up to us to decide. It's not up to a court to decide. It's their spectrum of what they can, their scope of what they can work within.
Another advantage, I guess, or validation of mediation has been the research done on the satisfaction that people have with the process. That the satisfaction level of people who have mediated concerns and are committed to the agreements that they've made is much higher than those who have litigated their concerns and who are told basically this is what you will do.
Right.
None of us like to really.
Because they're participatory in the end result, more so than just sharing
There's
their
an
story
ownership.
and saying their point of view. They're also participatory in resolving it, in the resolution and in the outcome.
Right.
So.
And they feel they've been heard in each party, so it's very different with that.
Yeah.
So one other question that probably people might have out there is, what about the cost of this thing? How does it compare to other things?
Yeah, I mean, and I guess I don't know everybody's fees, right? We don't know what everybody charges, but in general, if you're comparing it to some things, you know, you pay, it's a one-time kind of as-you-go thing. There's usually an hour, most mediators have an hourly rate that they charge. Sometimes mediation is on a sliding scale, again, depending on the mediator and how they practice.
And the income of the person.
And the income of the person, right? And there's not a retainer. We don't hold on to it like an attorney does. There's not a lump sum of money. It's an as-you-go. It's a pay per hour, pay per time process. So you need to speak with individual mediators and talk to them individually to see what their fees actually are, but that's the general idea, is that most of them offer a sliding scale that I know of, at least. They do not really require a retainer. I don't even know if we have the ability legally to hold a retainer. Yeah, that would be a little out of the norm for us.
You can find them on the internet through the court system.
Right. And basically you would, once you found a mediator, you could make a phone call to that mediator and find out information. And if you decide to work with that mediator, start the intake interview process with them.
Right. And just make sure you're comfortable. That might be a key thing. Are you comfortable speaking with this person?
Right.
Just
because you could end it after the intake interview
Sure.
if you decided to.
Sure.
You can, and the mediators can, if they find it's not suitable, because
Right.
not everything
That's a
is suitable.
possibility,
There are
yes.
some things that are not. So
Right.
I
Tom,
think most people like that it's their process, that they have choices.
Well, we want to thank you again for watching the Relationship Toolbox. Next time, we will be exploring the art of giving a sincere apology. We leave you with the following thought. Conflict does not have to destroy relationships. Consider mediation.